Today, let's discuss the ethical theory of Johann Gottfried von Herder. Herder was born in East Prussia, the son of a schoolteacher, so he grew up under modest circumstances. He went to the University of Königsberg and studied under Immanuel Kant, surely one of Kant's most illustrious students. At 20, he left and went to Riga, now Latvia, in order to become a schoolteacher. The very next year, he published an essay that immediately established his name. It's an essay called How Philosophy Can Become More Universal and Useful for the Benefit of the People. Well, that earned him a certain amount of fame, and after just a few more years, at age 25, he quit his job and began traveling throughout Europe, visiting a variety of well-known people, leaders in the German Enlightenment. He met Goethe, for example. Just 2 years later, at age 27, he won the Berlin Academy Prize for an essay called Treatise on the Origin of Language. So Herder made a name for himself very early. Now, it's surprising in a way because his style is not the usual philosophical style. It's informal, it's conversational. He writes dialogues. He writes in a way that is intentionally not the standard kind of academic writing, and in particular, not the kind of academic writing you find in German thinkers like Immanuel Kant or in Hegel or a variety of other people from that period. He's purposely trying to make philosophy accessible, make it the kind of thing that the average person can read. He thinks that philosophy can bring real benefits to the public, but in order to do that, it has to be written in a style that the average educated person can read. Richard Rorty said that Immanuel Kant turned philosophy into a profession, because basically you had to be a professional philosopher in order to understand his works. Herder thought that was a bad thing. He saw it happening around him and said, this is not what philosophy should be. So he purposely writes in a kind of conversational, informal tone. He tries to actually talk as if he's talking to the man in the street, and not just to academics, just to professional philosophers. One aspect of Herder's intellectual style goes along with that. He's quite unsystematic. He is not quite as epigrammatic as Nietzsche was to become, but nevertheless he begins that style of approaching philosophical questions. He does it in a way by quick observations, by shifts from topic to topic. He does not present a sustained systematic theory. He deals with things in much more the way we usually do in conversation. We approach an issue, we say this, we go off at a little tangent here, we come back, and so on. And he does that kind of thing rather than lay it all out in an architectonic whole. Now, in his case, it isn't just a matter of style. It's not just because he wants to be conversational, informal, and communicate with the larger public. It's because he's highly suspicious of theories. He thinks that philosophical systems are a bad idea. They're actually quite dangerous. Now, why is that true? Part of it, he says, is that the world is a complicated place. The idea that you're going to be able to explain everything, or explain everything that you care about within the context of a philosophical theory, by laying out a system, he thinks is a fundamental mistake. The world is far too messy, far too complicated for that. So there is no way to attain your goal. You're going to be making some serious mistakes. But it's actually worse than that, because a theory is going to lead you to look at certain kinds of evidence that are highly relevant to the theory and ignore evidence that seems, from the point of view of the theory, to be irrelevant. In other words, it's going to suggest that you look over in this area and ignore the things going on over here, and that's a very dangerous move. As Nassim Nicholas Taleb has pointed out, a theory is a dangerous thing to have. And why? Because it not only is inevitably wrong, it's something that is going to lead you to ignore certain critical kinds of evidence. So Herder understands that. He's saying, look, we have to start with the data, start with the phenomena. We have to look around ourselves and look in all sorts of directions for all kinds of evidence, and not wed ourselves to a theory. Now, you might say, well, certainly we shouldn't do that too early, but eventually we should come up with some kind of theory. Herder says, no. No matter how much of our time we've spent looking at various kinds of evidence, there are all sorts of things we have not considered. And the danger of a theory is that it will blind us in the future to those additional kinds of evidence that we need to examine. Nevertheless, Herder, as a philosopher, does have certain kinds of starting points, certain kinds of theoretical commitments at the bottom. In the theory of knowledge, what can we know? He says, I'm an empiricist. So he ties himself very clearly to experience. All concepts come from experience. All of our knowledge comes from experience. So he sees himself in a clearly empirical tradition that goes all the way back to Aristotle, extends through people like Aquinas, and then later John Locke and David Hume. What about ethics? In ethics, like Hume, he's a sentimentalist. He thinks that ethics is a matter of feeling, not a matter of reason. And so far, Herder might seem to be, well, a German Hume. But that's not quite right. And it's not right for a number of reasons we're going to examine. Really, his view is, I think, much subtler than Hume's. Now, you might say, well, it borders on inconsistency, and that may be true. I will talk about that and try to defend him just a little bit later. But nevertheless, he's within that broad kind of tradition. What about metaphysics, the most basic philosophical question? What is there? Here, Herder says, look, I'm not going to answer that question. Metaphysics is a mistake. So he rejects metaphysical discourse altogether. Now, why? Partly it's his empiricist starting point. He says, I think there is no way to actually get empirical data about whether, for example, the world consists of substances, about whether we should be idealists or realists, about any of the basic metaphysical questions. He says, look, these are not empirical questions. And so at certain points, he sounds like a positivist. He says, really, in the end, those questions are meaningless. But there's an additional skeptical epistemological argument going on in Herder as well. And that is that when we consider these questions, we're going to say, okay, here's an idealist account of the phenomenon. Here is a realist account of the phenomenon. Maybe we come up with things that are in between, like a quasi-realism or something like that. Whatever we do, we're going to be giving some kind of account, and maybe we succeed, maybe we don't. But his point is, look, in the end, this is a matter of bookkeeping. And so we've got this way of keeping the books, that way of keeping the books. You're asking which is the right way, which really reflects the way things are. And his answer is more or less, there's no way to tell. These questions are undecidable. So he advances something like a classical skeptical argument from variability. There might be a variety of ways of accounting for the world from a metaphysical point of view. We have no basis at all for deciding which of these are more successful than others. Consequence, we simply can't know. Maybe it is a meaningful question. Whether the world, for example, consists of mind-independent entities, or whether everything is mind-dependent. That's the critical question between the realist and the idealist. So let's suppose for a moment that is actually a meaningful question. Herder says, how could we ever know the answer? To the extent that we can give a realist account, to the extent that we can give an idealist account, they both kind of work. Neither of them is perfect because no philosophical systems are. But okay, they sort of succeed. Well, how would we ever be in a position to decide? So he says, in the end, there's no empirical question. They're both accounting for the empirical data more or less adequately. There is no basis for choosing among them. And so in the end, even if the questions are meaningful, there is no way to actually defend choosing this metaphysical approach over that one.